August 12, 30 BCE, Alexandria, Egypt. Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty, takes her own life. She's 39 years old. Her lover and political ally, Mark Antony, has already died by his own hand days earlier. Their combined forces have been defeated. Their children will be paraded through Rome in chains. Their dream of an Eastern empire is dead. Within months, Octavian, the man who defeated them, will return to Rome as the undisputed master of the known world. He'll soon become Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and he'll spend the rest of his life telling everyone who'll listen that Cleopatra was a dangerous seductress who'd bewitched Mark Antony with exotic Eastern magic and threatened to destroy Rome itself. That story, the one Octavian told, is the story we still believe today. 2,000 years later, when you hear the name Cleopatra, what comes to mind? A beautiful temptress, a seductress who used her feminine wiles to control powerful men, an exotic Eastern queen obsessed with luxury and pleasure, a threat to Roman civilization. But here's the thing, almost everything we know about Cleopatra was written by her enemies. The propaganda campaign Octavian launched against her was so successful that it shaped her image for 2 millennia. It's still shaping it today. This is the story of the greatest character assassination in history. How one man systematically destroyed a woman's reputation so thoroughly that we're still believing his lies thousands of years later. And why that matters? Because Cleopatra wasn't what you think she was. She was brilliant, politically shrewd, and came terrifyingly close to defeating Rome. Octavian knew it. That's why he had to destroy not just her life, but her entire legacy. This is the propaganda war against Cleopatra, and she never had a chance to fight back. Let's start with who Cleopatra actually was, because before we can talk about the lies, we need to understand the truth. Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years since Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy, claimed Egypt after Alexander's death. This is important. Cleopatra was ethnically Greek, not ethnically Egyptian. Her family was Macedonian. They'd been the foreign rulers of Egypt for generations. But unlike every other Ptolemaic ruler before her, Cleopatra actually learned to speak Egyptian. Her predecessors had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries and never bothered to learn the language of the people they governed. This tells you something crucial about her. She was strategic. She understood that to truly rule Egypt, she needed the support of Egyptians, not just the Greek elite in Alexandria. So she learned the language. And not just Egyptian. Ancient sources claim she spoke 9 languages fluently. She could negotiate with foreign ambassadors without translators, which gave her a massive diplomatic advantage. She was also highly educated. The Ptolemaic dynasty had founded the Library of Alexandria, the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. Cleopatra studied mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. She corresponded with scholars. She funded research. By any measure, she was one of the most educated people of her era. But here's what she wasn't. She wasn't particularly beautiful, at least not by the standards we'd recognize. We have coins with her face on them. She had a prominent nose, a strong chin, and a thin face. She looked regal, powerful, but not like a supermodel. Ancient writers who actually met her didn't rave about her beauty. They raved about her intelligence, her charm, her voice, and her wit. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing about 150 years after her death, said her beauty was not incomparable, but her conversation was irresistible, and her presence, combined with her charm and eloquence, was captivating. So if she wasn't the drop-dead gorgeous seductress of legend, why do we think she was? Because Octavian needed her to be. To understand why, we need to understand the situation Octavian was in. And to understand that, we need to talk about Julius Caesar's assassination and the civil wars that followed. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators who feared he was becoming too powerful. Too much like a king, Rome hated kings. The Republic had been founded on the idea of shared power, of preventing any one man from having too much control. Caesar's death created a power vacuum. 3 men emerged to fill it. Mark Antony, who'd been Caesar's second in command, Lepidus, a powerful general, and Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old adopted son and heir. These three formed the second triumvirate and divided the Roman world between them. Octavian got the west, Antony got the east, and Lepidus got Africa. This arrangement was always going to be temporary. Eventually, one of them would have to win. Octavian was young, inexperienced, and not particularly charismatic. But he was brilliant at politics and propaganda. He understood something fundamental. Winning wasn't enough. You had to control the narrative. Mark Antony, meanwhile, was a celebrated general, charismatic, popular with soldiers, and politically powerful. He was everything Octavian wasn't. If it came to a direct confrontation, Antony would probably win. Unless Octavian could make it not about Antony at all. Enter Cleopatra. Cleopatra had already been involved with Julius Caesar. She'd met him when he arrived in Egypt in 48 BCE during his civil war with Pompey. At the time, Cleopatra was 18 and locked in a power struggle with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was also her husband, because that's how the Ptolemaic dynasty worked. The famous story is that Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up in a carpet. This is probably propaganda too, by the way. It makes her seem dramatic and seductive. The truth is probably more mundane. She snuck into the palace to speak with Caesar before her brother could. Caesar sided with Cleopatra against Ptolemy. They became lovers, possibly for political reasons, possibly for genuine affection. Probably both. Cleopatra gave birth to a son she named Caesarion, Little Caesar, claiming Julius Caesar was the father. Caesar never officially acknowledged the boy, but he also never denied it. When Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra returned to Egypt. She was watching to see who would win the power struggle in Rome. Mark Antony won the East in the division of the triumvirate. In 41 BCE, he summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus. He needed money and supplies for his military campaigns. Egypt was the wealthiest kingdom in the region. She needed Roman protection and recognition. The meeting at Tarsus is where the legend really takes hold. Ancient sources describe Cleopatra arriving on a magnificent barge, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by incense and music, with attendants dressed as cupids fanning her. It was a theatrical display designed to impress and overwhelm. And it worked. Antony and Cleopatra became lovers and political allies. She would bear him 3 children, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. But here's what often gets lost. This was primarily a political alliance. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns. Cleopatra needed Roman military power to secure her throne and protect Egypt from being absorbed into the empire. They each had something the other desperately needed. For 10 years, this arrangement worked. Antony conducted his military campaigns in the east. Cleopatra provided financial support. They spent winters together in Alexandria. They had children. They may have genuinely loved each other, or they may have been two ambitious people using each other for mutual benefit. Probably both. But back in Rome, Octavian was building his power base and watching carefully. He'd sidelined Lepidus. Now only Antony stood in his way. And Antony was in the east, with Cleopatra, not in Rome maintaining his political alliances. Octavian saw his opening. He couldn't directly attack Antony, who was still popular and powerful. But he could attack Cleopatra. And if he made it look like Antony had been corrupted by Cleopatra, like he'd been bewitched and turned against Rome, then Octavian could position himself not as a rival for power, but as Rome's defender against a foreign threat. This is the propaganda war. And it was brilliant. First, Octavian needed to turn Cleopatra into a threat, not a political rival, which would be legitimate, but something darker, something other, something that good Romans should fear and hate. He started calling her the Egyptian wife. This was deliberate. Antony was still legally married to Octavian's sister, Octavia. By emphasizing Cleopatra as Antony's wife, Octavian made it personal. Antony had abandoned a virtuous Roman woman for an exotic foreign queen. He called her the harlot queen of incestuous Canopus. Canopus was a city near Alexandria, known for luxury and decadence. By associating Cleopatra with it, Octavian painted her as the embodiment of Eastern excess and corruption. He accused her of planning to rule from the Capitoline Hill in Rome. of wanting to make Alexandria the capital of the world, of threatening to destroy Roman civilization. There's no evidence she ever said or planned any of this. But it didn't matter. The accusation was the point. Octavian's propaganda portrayed the conflict as East versus West, civilization versus barbarism, Rome versus Egypt, masculine virtue versus feminine seduction, reason versus magic. This is where the seductress image really gets built. Octavian's propagandists claimed that Cleopatra used magic and potions to bewitch Antony, that she'd destroyed his reason and turned him into her puppet, that he was no longer acting as a Roman, but as her slave. This served multiple purposes. It explained why a respected Roman general would ally with a foreign queen against Rome. It wasn't Antony's fault, you see, he'd been bewitched. And it made Cleopatra the real enemy, not Antony. The poet Horace, who was friendly with Octavian, wrote propaganda poems calling Cleopatra a fatal monster and a crazed queen, plotting mad destruction. These poems were performed publicly and spread throughout Rome. Another poet, Propertius, called her the whore queen and claimed she'd made Antony forget his Roman dignity. This wasn't just poetic license. This was state-sponsored character assassination. But Octavian was too clever to make this about internal Roman politics. He needed a legitimate cause for war. So he did something unprecedented. He declared war not on Mark Antony, a Roman citizen and fellow triumvir, but on Cleopatra herself. This was genius. It meant the coming conflict wasn't a civil war between Romans. It was Rome defending itself against a foreign threat. Anyone who supported Cleopatra was supporting the enemy. Anyone who stayed neutral was shirking their duty to Rome. Antony was trapped. He could abandon Cleopatra and lose Egypt's resources, or he could stand with her and be painted as a traitor. He chose to stand with her. In 32 BCE, Octavian went further. He claimed to have obtained Antony's will and read it publicly to the Senate. The will supposedly said Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria with Cleopatra and that he recognized Caesarion as Julius Caesar's legitimate son. This was explosive. It meant Antony had turned his back on Rome even in death. And it meant there was a potential rival to Octavian, as Caesar's heir, Caesarion, was Caesar's biological son. Octavian was only his adopted son. We don't know if this will was real or if Octavian forged it. It doesn't matter. The damage was done. The propaganda campaign climaxed with the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's forces, led by his brilliant general Agrippa, faced the combined fleets of Antony and Cleopatra off the coast of Greece. What actually happened at Actium is disputed. The traditional narrative, which comes from Octavian's supporters, says that in the middle of the battle, Cleopatra suddenly fled with her ships Antony. So besotted with her that he couldn't think straight, abandoned his own men and followed her. His fleet, left without leadership, was destroyed. This story makes Cleopatra look cowardly and makes Antony look pathetic. It's probably not true. The more likely explanation is that the battle was already going badly. Disease had ravaged their forces, desertion had weakened them. Cleopatra's withdrawal with her ships was a strategic retreat to preserve the treasury she'd brought, and to regroup Antony followed, not because he was bewitched, but because the battle was lost, and continuing to fight would only mean unnecessary deaths. But Octavian's version is the one that survived. Cowardly foreign queen flees. Besotted Roman general abandons his duty to follow her. Rome triumphs over Eastern decadence. After Actium, it was over. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. Octavian followed with his army. There was no realistic chance of victory. Antony tried to negotiate, suggesting single combat with Octavian. Octavian ignored him. In August 30 BCE, as Octavian's forces entered Alexandria, false reports reached Antony that Cleopatra had killed herself. Devastated, Antony stabbed himself with his sword. He didn't die immediately. He was carried to Cleopatra, who was barricaded in her mausoleum. He died in her arms. Days later, Cleopatra took her own life. The famous story is that she used a poisonous snake, an asp. This has become the iconic image. Cleopatra with the asp at her breast, choosing a dramatic death befitting a queen. But this is probably propaganda too. Octavian controlled the narrative after her death. The snake story is dramatic, exotic, and foreign. It makes her death seem theatrical and Eastern, not Roman. Roman would fall on their sword. An Egyptian queen uses a sacred snake. The more likely scenario is that she poisoned herself with a mixture of toxins she'd tested and knew would work quickly and relatively painlessly. Cleopatra was educated in medicine and had access to poisons. She wouldn't have trusted her death to a snake that might fail to bite or might not be venomous enough. But the snake story is the one that survived because it fit Octavian's narrative better. After her death, Octavian had her son Caesarion hunted down and executed. The boy was 17, he was Julius Caesar's only biological son. He was also a threat to Octavian's claim to be Caesar's true heir. Octavian's advisor supposedly told him, "Too many Caesars is not good." Cleopatra's 3 children with Mark Antony were spared. They were taken to Rome and paraded through the streets in Octavian's triumph, displayed in golden chains as proof of his victory. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter, was eventually married off to a client king. The boys disappear from history. They probably died young, either from disease or quiet assassination. But even after Cleopatra's death, the propaganda continued, because Octavian needed to ensure that history remembered her the way he wanted. Over the next 40 years, as Octavian became Augustus and transformed Rome from republic to empire, the official story of Cleopatra hardened into fact. The poets Horace, Virgil, and Propertius all wrote works that portrayed her as Rome's enemy. These weren't historical accounts, they were propaganda dressed as literature. But they were brilliant propaganda. They made Octavian's victory seem inevitable, righteous, and necessary. Horace's Ode 1.37, written shortly after Actium, celebrates Cleopatra's death while calling her a fatal monster who'd plotted to destroy Rome. But even Horace admits, grudgingly, that she died nobly, refusing to be paraded in triumph. This is the only concession the propaganda makes to the truth. Cleopatra died by her own choice, denied Octavian his final humiliation of her. Later, Roman historians continued the pattern. They had access to multiple sources, but they overwhelmingly preferred accounts that portrayed Cleopatra as Octavian wanted. Plutarch, writing about 150 years after Cleopatra's death, is one of our main sources for her life. He's more balanced than the poets, acknowledging her intelligence and education. But he still frames her primarily through her relationships with Caesar and Antony, and he still includes all the seduction narratives. Cassius Dio, writing about 200 years after her death, is even more hostile. He portrays her as manipulative, power-hungry, and dangerous. He claims she tried to seduce Octavian after Antony's death and was refused because Octavian was too virtuous to fall for her tricks. This is almost certainly false. Octavian had won. Cleopatra had no leverage. She was trying to negotiate for her children's safety, not seduce her enemy. But the story makes Octavian look strong and principled while making Cleopatra look desperate and pathetic. Every Roman source we have was written in a world where Octavian and his successors controlled the narrative. Writers who wanted success, patronage, or even just safety didn't contradict the official story. And what about Egyptian sources? What did Egyptians say about their last pharaoh? Almost nothing survived. When Rome annexed Egypt after Cleopatra's death, Egyptian independence ended. Egyptian culture was gradually suppressed, and Romanized Egyptian records were destroyed or lost. We have fragmentary inscriptions that show Cleopatra was worshipped as a goddess during her lifetime, which was traditional for pharaohs. We have temple reliefs showing her in traditional Egyptian style as Isis, the mother goddess. We have evidence that ordinary Egyptians respected and supported her. But we don't have Egyptian historical accounts from her time. Those were lost. What survived was the Roman version. This is how propaganda wins. Not by convincing everyone immediately, but by lasting longer than the truth. By making sure that centuries later, only one version of the story remains. For 2,000 years, we've been seeing Cleopatra through Roman eyes. Through Octavian's eyes, Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written in 1606, draws heavily on Plutarch. It's beautiful literature, but it perpetuates the propaganda Cleopatra is passionate, theatrical, manipulative, and ultimately destructive. The 1934 film Cleopatra, with Claudette Colbert, shows her as a seductress using her sexuality to control men. The 1963 film with Elizabeth Taylor is gorgeous, but reinforces every propaganda stereotype: exotic, sexual, dangerous. Modern popular culture continues the pattern. Cleopatra Halloween costumes are sexy. Cleopatra in advertising is about luxury and seduction. Cleopatra references in music and movies almost always emphasize her relationships with powerful men and her use of sexuality. Even recent attempts to reclaim or reframe Cleopatra often focus on defending her sexuality rather than questioning why that's the primary thing we talk about. The propaganda is so deep, so old, so successful that it shapes how we think without us even realizing it. But here's what we should remember instead. Cleopatra ruled Egypt for 21 years. For most of that time, she ruled alone, without a male co-regent. Which was unusual for the Ptolemaic dynasty. She maintained Egypt's independence in a world where Rome was swallowing every other kingdom in the Mediterranean. She spoke at least 9 languages and could negotiate directly with foreign leaders without translators. She was educated in mathematics, philosophy, and medicine at a time when most people, including most rulers, were illiterate. She commanded a navy and personally participated in military campaigns. At the Battle of Actium, she wasn't hiding in the palace. She was on a warship with her fleet. She used religion strategically, portraying herself as the goddess Isis to legitimize her rule in Egyptian eyes. She used economics strategically, controlling Egypt's grain exports to give her leverage over Rome. She formed political alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, not because she seduced them, but because she was the queen of the wealthiest kingdom in the region, and they needed what she had. She nearly succeeded in creating an Eastern empire that could rival Rome. If the Battle of Actium had gone differently, if disease hadn't ravaged her forces, if a few strategic decisions had changed, she might have won, and world history would be completely different. She was brilliant, strategic, ruthless when necessary, and ambitious. She played the most dangerous political game in the ancient world and came closer to winning than anyone had a right to expect. But she lost, and Octavian won, and winners write history. The propaganda war against Cleopatra teaches us something important about how history works. We like to think that truth eventually wins, that facts eventually emerge, that history gets corrected over time. But that's not always what happens. Sometimes propaganda is so effective, so thorough, and lasts so long that it becomes indistinguishable from history. The lie outlives the truth. Octavian understood something that modern propagandists still understand. You don't have to convince everyone. You just have to control the narrative. You have to make your version of events the default, the one that gets repeated, the one that gets taught, the one that gets remembered. And you have to destroy alternative narratives. Octavian didn't just defeat Cleopatra militarily, he defeated her historically. He made sure that for thousands of years, we'd see her through his eyes. He turned a formidable political opponent into a seductress. He turned a military commander into a coward. He turned a strategic alliance into bewitchment. He turned near conquest of Rome into exotic Eastern decadence, threatening civilization. And it worked. For 2 millennia, it worked. Even now, knowing all this, it's hard to see Cleopatra clearly. The propaganda is baked into our cultural DNA. When we hear her name, we think of Elizabeth Taylor in golden costumes, not of a woman who could negotiate trade deals in 9 languages. This isn't just about one ancient queen. It's about how propaganda shapes everything we think we know about history. It's about how victors control narratives. It's about how character assassination can last for centuries. And it's about power. Who has it, how they maintain it, and how they destroy anyone who threatens it. Cleopatra threatened Roman power, not because she was a seductress, but because she was smart, resourceful, and came dangerously close to winning. Octavian had to defeat her twice, once on the battlefield and once in history. The battlefield victory was temporary, the historical victory was permanent. That's the real genius of the propaganda war. It didn't just kill Cleopatra. It erased who she actually was and replaced her with a stereotype that served Rome's interests. 2,000 years later, we're still believing it. So the next time you hear about Cleopatra the seductress, the beautiful queen who used her feminine wiles to control powerful men, remember, that's not history, that's propaganda. And it was written by a man who needed very badly for you to believe it, because the truth was more dangerous. The truth was that Cleopatra was brilliant, strategic, and powerful in her own right. That she didn't seduce Rome's leaders, she negotiated with them as an equal, and that scared Rome more than any army ever could. That's why the lies had to last forever, because the truth was too threatening to allow. Octavian won the propaganda war so completely that we're still fighting it today, still trying to excavate the real Cleopatra from under 2 millennia of systematic character assassination. And maybe that's the final victory of propaganda. Even when we know it's propaganda, even when we can trace exactly how and why it was created, it still shapes how we see the world. Cleopatra died in 30 BCE, but Octavian's version of her has lived for over 2,000 years. That's the power of controlling the narrative. That's the power of propaganda. And that's why this story still matters today. Because the same techniques, the same strategies, the same systematic destruction of reputation and replacement of truth with useful fiction, it's all still happening. Different names, different countries, different technologies for spreading the message. But the same game, the same war. And just like 2,000 years ago, most people never realize they're on a battlefield. Cleopatra lost the propaganda war. She never had a chance to fight back, to tell her side, to defend her legacy. All we can do now is recognize that the story we inherited isn't the whole truth, that history is written by victors, that propaganda works, and that maybe, just maybe, we should question what else we believe simply because we've heard it repeated enough times. The greatest trick Octavian ever pulled was convincing the world that his lies about Cleopatra were facts. 2,000 years later, he's still winning. But now you know. Now you can see the propaganda for what it is. And that's the only way the war ever ends, by recognizing that it's still being fought. Everything you thought you knew about Cleopatra was written by the man who killed her. Remember that. And ask yourself, what else have you been told by the victors, accepted as truth, never questioned? Because propaganda doesn't die with its creator. It lives in every person who believes it, repeats it, teaches it to the next generation. Cleopatra has been dead for over 2,000 years, but Octavian's propaganda about her is still very much alive. And maybe that's the most successful propaganda campaign in human history. Not because it convinced everyone at the time, but because it convinced everyone who came after, including us.